That's the argument for God is.
All right, give me a second to read this.
That's
Okay, just a quick little comment. Right? It seems like God, the terms good and evil don't apply to God because God is above good and evil, right? We can't categorize the actions of God with good and evil. Similarly, only human beings are subject to good and evil, right? The problem that I'm having is, from what I understand, God or good in the Christian worldview is defined in virtue of God. So to say that God's actions cannot be categorized by good or evil, to me seems similar to saying God is not subject to his own definition of what is considered good, right? So you'd basically be saying, because the person defining the action doesn't even have actions that are categorized by its own definitions, or his own definitions, I suppose. It just seems like these definitions of good and evil are defined arbitrarily, unless you're trying to say God defines good and evil but doesn't hold himself to them. But that doesn't make any sense either, because if he defines something but then doesn't hold himself to the concepts of good and evil, it just sounds like he's making arbitrary rules that are justified in virtue of God, and then the whole point of your argument wouldn't follow, because then you're still saying God is defined, or I'm sorry, good is defined in virtue of God, right? You would just be removing the part of the tautology where God says God is good. But that doesn't exactly clarify anything. If you're saying God is in the sense that God is just God, right? God is just whatever God does, whatever God's intentions are. That's just, it's either one of two things, right? It's either a tautology, because you're still saying, God is God, or you're just saying God exists, right? God is, which of course is a completely uninformative statement, right? Obviously, based on your worldview, we can assume that you think God exists. You don't really need to restate that with any sort of argument. So I just don't understand what the argument is even attempting to accomplish, right? If your goal is to get out of the God is good tautology, it just seems like you've gotten out of the tautology by either A, creating another tautology, or B, you've just made a trivial statement, right? God exists. So I don't understand the point, I guess. Could you kind of clarify that for me?
Well, so we define good and evil as Christians objectively as that which is reflective of God's nature. So we say, because we are subject to God's authority and God is the maximally great being, that what is contained within God's nature is what we would define to be good for our own actions. But when it comes to attempting to define the actions of God as good or evil, we as subjects can say, I don't think God did a good thing there, but it has no authority over God. We can bitch and moan and complain about God genociding all the people of the planet except for Noah and his menagerie. But simply because we view it as good, as subjects to God, doesn't mean that the action was good or bad. It is merely the fact that God, holding to no higher authority, as an agent, and an agent being defined as the capacity to act in a particular situation, that God's actions are at all times justified. A justified does not necessarily belay good. It just belays justified.
Well, that doesn't make sense to me either, because at the beginning of your response, what you said was good is defined in virtue of God's nature, right? So if good is defined in virtue of God's nature, right, we can infer that God's nature is good, which would mean God defines good but is himself good, which is just restating the tautology that you've tried to get out of, right? That's not a resolution to the tautology. It just sounds like you've sort of attempted to explain the tautology in other words, but you've just restated the tautology. Anytime you say good is defined in virtue of God's nature, right, that means God's nature is to be good. But God defines goodness by your own admission, right? We hold ourselves to God's definition of good. That's just restating the tautology. It doesn't make sense to say, well, he doesn't actually, we can't categorize his actions as either good or evil, right? We just say they're justified because you said his nature is defined as goodness. So again, right, that's just a restatement of the tautology that you've tried to get out of.
So I didn't say that God's nature is defined as goodness. I said that we, as subjects of God's authority, understanding that God is the maximally great being, define our actions as good or bad, dependent on his nature. But when we talk about God's nature, if we merely remove all of creation and understand that God is the only existence, there is no defining God's existence as good or bad. It merely is the fact that God exists.
But Kathleen,
When he created beings in his own image, the capacity for agency and the capacity to make decisions. The difference is that we are subject to God's authority. So we can disobey the will of God. God cannot disobey his own will. So when we talk about good and bad, in a third-person perspective, us looking up to God, we can absolutely define action as good or bad. But from a first-person perspective, from God looking down, in an attempt to better understand that which has not been revealed, the position that I take is that it is not possible to define morality or immorality in terms of a maximally great being, only that maximally great being is authorized at all times per his actions.
Right. I don't think that position would even be consistent with the Bible, right? Because to me, if you're trying to make that argument, it just sounds like God's actions are justified by his own nature, but the concepts of good and evil are actually stipulated by humans, right? Good and evil are human constructs. If you're attempting to make that argument, that's just moral relativism. That's just subjective morality, which of course can't hold, because in Christianity, the concepts of good and evil, the concept of morality, is very much defined in virtue of God's nature. And you kind of restated this yourself, because you said, right, God's definition of good is whatever God's nature is. So therefore, God's nature is to be good by his own definition. And it doesn't really matter at that point what your justification of saying this, God is good, doesn't hold is. You're just still saying God defines good. It is in God's nature to be good, right? So therefore, God creates the definition of good, but God is also good, which is just, again, restating the tautology. And like I said, if you're trying to make the other argument, which is just to say, well, God doesn't require any sort of moral justification, but the concepts of good and evil are instead propositions made by mankind, that doesn't hold either, because that would mean somebody can just say, I shoot a guy, that's good. Why? Because God has not defined what is good or evil, right? And you kind of commented on this yourself. You said, well, our concepts of good and evil are referential to God's nature, right? So that is again, that's the same thing as saying God's nature is to be good, but you've also said God defines good. So Kathleen, I just don't understand how. One second, then I'll pass the mic. It's just I just don't understand how you're escaping the tautology. It just seems like you're restating it.
So I'm getting a little lost. You made about 15 points, so I'm not going to be able to address them all.
Sure.
I have not said that God defines himself as good. That's twice that you've said I've said that, not said that once. God's nature, what God has revealed to us about his nature, is contained through revelation in the Bible. And I would accept that God has revealed certain aspects to himself, but he has not revealed everything. That is left to the mystery. But we are curious about the mystery. So what does it mean to say that God is a moral agent? Because there's a difference between a being having agency and a being containing moral agency. And so when we talk about morality, simply because we define what is good and bad as obedience or righteousness, or disobedience and unrighteousness to the will and nature of God, doesn't inform us about any morality contained within God. God merely states, God merely does, and he's not beholden to any kind of moral code. If God wants to wipe every living thing out on the planet, he is free to do so, and would be completely justified. But merely because he is free to do so and justified doesn't make the act good or bad. I would argue in the case of a maximally great being who answers to no one else, that the idea of is this good or is this bad, should I do this, should I not do this, is not even going to enter the mind of such a creation. He is merely going to say, this is what I desire. And as Christianity would say, anything that God desires manifests itself in this reality. So if God desires that this reality should end right now, it will end. And that has no moral judgment on God. We may say, I don't want to die, don't kill me, I think that's immoral, but that's irrelevant because we have no capacity to alter God's desires.
Okay, it sounds like what you're saying is equivocable to saying God is not a moral agent, right? He doesn't hold himself to any concept of morality. His actions are just justified in virtue of him being God, right? But you've also said that human beings, when they profess something to be good or evil, right, these concepts are referential to the nature of God. We perceive God's nature to be good. He just doesn't necessarily hold to that same concept. But if you're saying that God is not a moral agent, right, but he also created the concepts of morality, and presumably you hold to moral realism, unless you don't, you can correct me, the only possibilities are as follows. The first possibility is that God is aware that what he's doing is good or evil, right? Because that would mean God, despite creating the concept of objective morality in the first place, just chooses not to hold himself to it, which means God presumably could be in violation of categorical moral norms that he has created, which would mean God is potentially committing evil actions, right? And I don't think you're prepared to say it is in God's nature to do evil, right? By your own admission, you don't even think the concept of evil would apply to God. And beyond that, right, what you're still in effect saying is God is not a moral agent. He doesn't hold himself to morality, but he creates categorical moral norms to which mankind refers. We refer to the concept of good as consistent with God's nature, right? So therefore God's nature, again, and I feel like I've stated this a few times, God's nature would therefore be good, right?
Why are you assuming that God created morality?
Well, because the alternative is that there are categorical moral norms which exist outside of God's influence, which would mean if you believe that, right, if you believe there is such a thing as an external good or evil without God's influence, you'd run into the same problem. God could be doing things that are evil relevant to those categorical moral norms, which is inconsistent with your claim that God is not a moral agent, right? Just saying God's actions are justified because he's God wouldn't follow, right, if you think there is such a thing as an external moral norm that God holds himself to. Because if you just say, well, God doesn't have to hold himself to those categorical moral norms, God just is, right? That's your argument. God just is a self-justifying agent. You'd either have to say God defines morality, or he's defined by external morality, which would again mean he's potentially doing evil things. I don't understand. Look, you're either restating the tautology, as I've already explained, right? You're just saying it's in God's nature to be good. We define God's nature as good, therefore God's nature is good, therefore God is good, restating the tautology. Or you think that there are categorical moral norms not ordained by God, which would mean that God is potentially in violation of categorical moral norms, which would mean by definition he could be evil, which is inconsistent with your claim.
So I will try to answer all of those things. I'm going to go back to why do you assume God created morality?
Just one second before you respond. I already accounted for the possibility of God not creating morality, right? You still run into a problem even if you grant that God didn't create morality.
So I don't think I do, right? We don't say that God created logic, right? We say that logic is merely a manifestation of God's thinking, which is perfectly logical. And that is how we have logic in the universe. That's how we had the capacity to discover logic, because the universe was created in a manner that reflects God's thinking, which is orderly, perfectly logical. And that's why we have access to the laws of thought, contradiction, excluded middle, so on and so forth. Now, if we look to morality, morality is defined objectively in the Christian faith as obedience or disobedience to the will of God. So it's completely different from some kind of secular attempt to understand morality. Because when we talk about things that are good and bad, we are merely saying that if we are obedient to God, we are being good. And if we are being disobedient to God, then we are being bad. But God cannot disobey himself. So does that belie that God is at all times good? Well, I don't necessarily think so, because we wouldn't define logic as good or bad. We would merely say that logic is merely a manifestation of God's thinking. So when we talk about disobedience to the will of God or something like that, with morality is merely a manifestation of our understanding of God's nature. God's nature being a certain thing, just, merciful, loving, and that manifests itself in this reality through his creation, through us, and we say, okay, well, how do I disobey God? Okay, well, disobeying God would be to, do something that he said not to do. So, for instance, in the Garden of Eden, when he says, you can eat from all of these trees except for this one, okay? And God wasn't making a normative statement there. He was making a positive statement. Do not eat of this. And when Adam ate of it, he disobeyed God.
That's not correct. Right? Saying it's not a normative statement is just wrong, right?
It's not a normative statement.
Well,
a normative statement is a value judgment.
No, the statement is you ought not to eat the apple because eating the apple is against the will of God. That's still a normative statement, right?
No, it's not.
Just 1 second. You can't just say it's a positive statement. That doesn't mean anything. Any moral statement of any kind, whether you define it in terms of God ordaining morality, or you define it in terms of some external categorical moral norms that precede God, whatever you define it as, morality any moral statement by definition is a normative statement.
But God was not making a normative statement there. He was not making a value statement. He was making a fact of the matter statement. He was making a positive statement that says that it is a fact that if you eat of this tree, you will die.
Yeah,
that is not an opinion. That is not a judgment. That is a fact of the matter.
Kathleen, that's a normative statement. You ought not to eat of the tree because you will die. Right? There was no ought in there. There was no ought in there. It doesn't matter if he literally said you ought not to do it, right? If you say, God says, do not eat of this tree, that's a normative statement, because that logically can be inferred to mean you ought not to eat of this tree because it is in violation of God's will. So that's a normative statement.
I'm just going to disagree.
Do you think it's not a normative statement when you tell your child not to put your hand on the stove?
I'm not entertaining you, Seth.
Can you answer my question?
No, I can't. I need you to butt out.
Well, can you ask the question of Kathleen?
Tom, if you can't control your audience, I'm going to discontinue
Kathleen
this.
is being difficult.
Wait, who's interrupting?
Seth.
Oh, Seth. This is a one-on-one. Sorry.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Seth came in afterwards, so he wasn't here.
Oh, he's been here.
Don't blame Tom for this.
So I understand why you would see it as a normative statement, right? If we were to say that God is making a moral statement about this tree, if he's saying, there is some kind of moral implication about eating this tree, right? But God's not making a moral implication. He's just stating a natural fact, which removes the ought.
Okay, so let me make sure I have this correct before I respond. The statement is, in your mind, the factual statement is, don't eat of this tree because you, not the normative statement, I'm sorry. The factual statement is don't eat of this tree because you will die. Is that the statement?
Yeah, and it's a
okay. Just 1 second. Don't eat of this tree because you will die is a morally normative statement, right? Morality is just the difference between right and wrong. It is wrong to eat of the tree because either A, it's in violation of God's will, or B, you will die. You ought not to eat of the tree because X consequence will happen. That, Kathleen, is a normative statement. You can't just say, I'm really confused. You can't just say it's a statement of fact, right? Even if you grant that it's a moral fact that eating from the tree is wrong, even if we grant that, saying you shouldn't eat of the tree because you will die, or if you eat from the tree you will die, that's still normative. It doesn't matter what the justification of the morality is.
So when we look at this, and I'm not necessarily trying to concentrate on this just one verse, right? But the verse reads that you can eat of any fruit or tree of this garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
I just need you to pause. I need to turn you up. I can barely hear you. Just 1 second.
Okay.
Continue.
That if you eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. Right? Now, I could come along and say, I don't want to die. I desire to live. Therefore, I ought not eat of this tree. So from my perspective, it would be a normative statement. But I'm not trying to understand the human perspective here. This entire argument has absolutely nothing to do with me attempting to understand the human perspective. I understand the human perspective. I am trying to understand the mystery of God, the parts that he hasn't revealed. Right? So when God says, you can eat of all of this fruit except for the tree of good and the knowledge of good and evil, because if you do so, you will surely die. Right? God is just informing. It would be the same thing of me coming up to you and saying, "Don't shoot up a massive amount of heroin. You will surely die." Well, that doesn't tell us anything about whether or not shooting up the heroin is a moral thing to do or an immoral thing to do, because I don't have access to your desires.
I think you misunderstand. If you say, don't shoot up heroin because you will surely die, right? There's a presupposition there. The presupposition being this agent that's shooting up the heroin has some value that is opposed to death, right? Their death. So therefore, the statement is, you ought not to shoot up heroin because you will die.
That doesn't follow. That doesn't follow. It could be the case.
Please let me finish, right? I don't understand. I don't know what you think normativity is, right? But anytime you say something is right or wrong, right, you can't just get out of that by saying, oh, it's a statement of fact. Because again, even if we grant that something about the action being wrong is a moral fact, there's still a normative statement. There's still an ought claim. You ought not to do X because it's wrong. You're
skipping a step, mate.
Please, let me finish. Every moral statement is a moral normative statement. There's just no way out of that logically.
I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree that every moral statement is normative, but there's no moral statement being made here.
Kathleen, you just said that it wasn't a normative statement, that it was a fact. That doesn't make any sense.
Pogan, please. All right? Like, I don't know what's going on here, right? If I come up to you and say, and if we're just talking pragmatically for a minute, and I hand you, and both our sense perception works identical, and I hand you a red apple, and I say, this apple is red. Does that say anything about the morality of that apple?
That's a false equivalency.
I'm not done. I'm asking a question. I'm trying to build an argument. Is that a normative statement or a positive statement about the apple?
That again, that's a false
answer the
equivalency.
Question. Can you just answer the question?
So you're asking me if it's a normative statement that the apple is red.
I'm asking you if that is a normative or a positive statement. Is it a value judgment that the apple is red, or is it a fact of the matter that the apple is red. A natural fact that the pigments in the skin of the apple are red.
That would be a fact.
Okay, great. Now, if I were to turn around and say, and if you eat this apple, it'll kill you. Is that a moral statement? Or is it still just a fact of the matter that the apple is poisonous and would kill you?
That's normative.
No, that's positive. I did not say, if you eat this apple, you will die, and because you will die, I don't think you should eat it.
No,
I merely gave you a fact of the nature of that particular apple, that particular apple was red and is poisonous and will kill you. I didn't say whether it is good or bad, whether or not it will kill you. I didn't ask whether you value life or not. You didn't ask me whether I value your life or not. I merely stated that this apple will kill you.
Yeah,
I make no moral statement there.
Am I going to be allowed to respond? Yeah, there's an implicit normative claim. Anytime you say something of that nature, if you say the apple is red, right? That's just a fact. I granted you. If you say this apple will kill you, right? There's an implicit normative claim you're making that I ought not to eat the apple, right? Because if I eat the apple, it'll kill me. It's just implicit in the statement. And if you say it's just a statement of fact, right? What you're saying is anytime God makes a statement of fact with reference to something, for instance, don't eat of this tree, you will die, right? What you'd essentially be saying.
Well, I don't think we can get past this.
I'm not finished speaking.
I just don't think we can get past this point.
Well, I mean, you're over talking me, right? It's just a difference between description and prescription, right? Apple is red. That's a description. Don't eat this apple, you will die. That's prescriptive. You're prescribing that I will die if I eat the apple.
I didn't say don't. No. There's your problem right there. I never said don't eat the apple.
Kathleen, it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually, listen to me, it doesn't actually matter. If you prescribe that the apple will kill me if I eat it, that is still an implicit normative claim because you're prescribing, you're prescribing that eating the apple will kill me. Therefore, implicit in the statement is I ought not to eat the apple because I will die.
No, that's a non sequitur.
It's not a non sequitur. I'm describing the difference between a descriptive and a prescriptive statement.
I am telling you that in no way, in no will, does it follow from me telling you that this will kill you, right? Telling me that this thing will kill you says absolutely nothing about whether or not I want you to die or not. If I made the statement, don't eat this apple, because if you do, you will die, that is a normative statement because I am belaying the fact that I value your life and don't want you to die. But if I say, this apple is poisonous, and if you eat it, it will kill you, says absolutely nothing because the word don't isn't in there, so I have not made a moral statement because I have not placed any value.
You just presupposed the value of my life.
No, right? I haven't.
1 second. I need. What do you think normativity is? What is your definition of normativity?
I'm not. Look. It doesn't logically follow, Pogan. Simply because something can kill you does not me and my value of a particular thing. It is merely a fact that the apple is red, and it is merely a fact that the apple is poisonous, and it is merely a fact that if you eat the apple, you will be poisoned, and it is merely a fact that you will die from being poisoned. Nowhere in there did I say, I don't want you to be poisoned, so you ought not eat that apple.
Okay,
I merely gave you facts about the apple.
You're not answering my question. What is your definition of normativity?
A value judgment, a recommendation, something that can be disagreed with, an opinion.
No, that's not the philosophical definition of what normativity is. Something is said to have normativity when it entails that some action, attitude, or mental state of some kind is justified, an action one ought to do or a state one ought to be in, right? So again, when you say the apple is red, that's a descriptive statement Okay, you're just describing an attribute of the apple that I can observe. When you say this apple, if you eat it, will kill you, you're prescribing that there is an action that will result from eating the apple. And that prescription is a normative statement because you're saying you ought not to eat the apple, or you ought to eat the apple. Your value death is. But what you cannot get out of is saying that this apple will kill you is not a prescriptive statement. So there's three possibilities. Either you deny that the apple will kill you is a prescriptive statement, right? You deny that the definition of normativity I gave you is valid, or you deny the entire concept of ethics, really. You deny the entire concept of pretty much any philosophical statement, right? Norms are intrinsic to pretty much any ethical statement. I really don't know where to go from here. I mean, if you want
I really don't either, because what you're saying.
Okay, I wasn't finished speaking, right? What you're doing is that you're denying essentially that the eating this apple will kill you is a prescriptive statement, which is just, I mean, if you accept philosophical definitions of what a prescriptive statement is, that's just factually wrong. It's just not in line with the definition of prescription, of normativity. So you just have a fundamental error in how you're understanding normativity and prescription.
Well, I'm just going to fundamentally disagree with that as well, because what you said didn't disagree with what I said. Something that is a value statement, a value judgment, belays ought statements, belays good and bad statements, right? We place value on things. That's how we get to ought statements. We place desirability on things. I value my dog, ergo I ought feed my dog, because I don't want my dog to die. That is a normative statement. It is a positive statement to say, if I don't feed my dog, it'll die. But that statement tells me nothing about the value of the dog. It tells you nothing about the value of the dog. It merely states that it is a fact that if you deny food to an animal, it will die. Now, if I turn around and say, I don't want my dog to die.
It's a fact that if you eat the apple, you will die. Right?
Yes, which is a positive statement.
Okay, so both of these statements are prescriptive. You ought to feed your dog because it will die if you don't. You ought not to eat the apple, right? Because if you do, you will die.
No,
you don't understand. Excuse me, right? A description is not the same as a prescription. The apple will kill you if you eat it is a prescriptive statement. Right? It's implied that there is a normative statement being made about what you ought to do with respect to consuming or not consuming the apple. And if you deny that, right, and you try to say the apple will kill you is somehow descriptive, right, you're just factually incorrect with the nature of description and prescription. So I'm going to be honest with you, Kathleen, right? I don't think we can proceed past this point if you don't accept that that's a prescriptive statement.
I don't accept that as a prescriptive statement. I have a positive statement.
Then there's no statement I can possibly make to you that will communicate why you're making normative statements, right? Because you just don't accept normativity, it seems like.
No, I do accept normativity.
I'm not finished speaking.
Accept normative statements. I just don't accept your definition of it.
Kathleen, what you're saying is that you refute the philosophical definition of what normativity is.
No, I don't. What I'm saying is that you are not grasping the philosophical definition, but differentiation between a positive and a normative statement. Because there is no value statement. Simply because something will die if it doesn't do something does not belay any moral or immoral, any value judgment upon that. It is merely just a state of nature that if you eat something poisonous,
what's a positive statement?
Die. A positive statement is a fact of the matter statement.
Well, it can be the fact of the matter that you die while still being a prescriptive statement. The apple is read as descriptive. Also, if you say it's a positive statement, if you say it's a fact of the matter, right, what you're just saying it's descriptive, right? But the problem is that when you say the apple will kill you, that's prescriptive by the nature of the syntax, by the nature of your statement. You're prescribing that if I consume this apple, it'll kill me. And therefore, what you're prescribing is some ought action with respect to the apple. I ought to either A, eat the apple because I want to die for some absurd fucking reason, or B, I ought to not eat the apple because I don't want to die. You are making a prescriptive statement. There is no way out of that. You cannot try to say that the apple will kill you is somehow just a descriptive statement, because that's just incorrect. It's incorrect with the respect to the syntax. It just doesn't work.
You can push. And also, this really doesn't have much to do with God is, but I think that's pretty much the conclusion of this.
So one final point: if you don't even accept normativity as I've defined it, right? If you have some other definition of what normativity is, why are you including normativity in your argument for God is? Right? Because if you, one second. If you think it's just a fact of the matter, you wouldn't have gone through all this trouble to justify why human beings make normative statements in the first place. You would just have said, "Oh, bad, evil, we're done." Right? It wouldn't have even been an argument. You clearly are making normative statements. You clearly have some grasp of what normativity is. It's just you're not even. It's just you're using normativity improperly right here, and I don't understand why. So, I mean, if you're unwilling to accept that, I don't think we can move past this.
Yeah, no, you're right, because I don't see any more statement in the statement that if you eat of the tree of good and evil, you will die. There's no moral statement there. God's not making a moral statement. He's just stating that if you eat this food, you'll die. It could be the same thing as if he was saying, if you don't eat any food, you will die. Right? Period, end of story. Just like with the dog. It is just a state of nature. If I don't feed my dog, it's going to die. That doesn't tell you whether or not I want the dog to die. Doesn't tell you whether I want the dog to live. Just the same thing with the heroin user. Me saying heroin will kill you doesn't say anything about whether or not the heroin user should die or should not die, and it doesn't tell you anything about whether or not the heroin user is suicidal and is doing heroin for the explicit purpose of dying without any kind of pain or suffering or anything like that. So no, there's no value statements, there's no moral judgments there. It's just stating that if you do these things, you're gonna die.
Tom, can I move to a final statement here?
Go ahead, move to the final statement.
Right. So we started with her giving this argument for God is by trying to explain that God is somehow self-justifying, right? And that our concepts of good and evil are just referential to the nature of God. She wouldn't accept that the nature, saying something is good in the nature of God means that God's nature is good, and that would just be a restatement of the original tautology. She wouldn't accept. And then we got into her example of a normative, her distinction between normative and descriptive claims, right? She gave the example of, if I say the apple is red, that's just a description of the apple's attributes. But then if I say, eating this apple will kill you, that's somehow still a descriptive claim. She wouldn't accept that when you say this apple will kill you, you're prescribing that the apple will kill you, which means there is some normative statement there by the nature of prescription. You ought to eat the apple if you want to die, or you ought not to eat the apple if you don't want to die. That's just the nature of what a prescriptive statement is. And to deny that that's a prescriptive statement is just a misunderstanding of what description and prescription are. So I just don't understand. It just seems like there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what normativity is, right? There just seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between description and prescription. She doesn't accept that she's restating the tautology. She hasn't adequately demonstrated that this somehow escapes the tautology which she originally stated she was trying to escape from. I conclude by saying it's just an incoherent argument, and there needs to be some hashing out with Kathleen of the difference between description and prescription and why prescription entails normative statements. I'd also ask whoever is running this, I guess Tom, to put up a straw poll, so we can see, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Kathleen has an amazing argument, but I would be interested in seeing what people thought of this dialogue. So I'll pass the mic to Kathleen.
Yeah, I have no closing statement.
Okay. In that case, somebody in chat can set up a straw poll, and we can see what the general opinion regarding this discussion was.